Musgrave Harbour, a picturesque town on Newfoundland's northeast coast, became the unlikely focus of a workplace investigation in 2021, an investigation that would divide its council and disrupt its governance. At the heart of this inquiry was newly elected Councillor Grant Abbott, whose vision for the community sparked both excitement and controversy. But as the town plunged into tension and accusations against Mr. Abbott, an investigation was launched to determine whether his actions amounted to harassment as claimed. This story, however, is far more complex than a simple case of right or wrong. It's about communication breakdowns, personal clashes, and the unintended consequences of passion. In 2020, Mr. Abbott returned to Musgrave Harbour from Ontario as the COVID epidemic reared its ugly head, along with his wife and mother-in-law, who are from war-torn El Salvador, and with 3 children and a cat. Mr. Abbott's wife and mother-in-law were excited to embrace small-town life, imagining the kind of close-knit communities seen in Hallmark Christmas movies, where everyone comes together in the spirit of warmth and collaboration. Mr. Abbott, too, was filled with a desire to contribute to the town's development and revitalisation. Armed with ambitious ideas like sustainable food production and a large community garden and its complete design, Mr. Abbott was eager to bring new life and enthusiasm to Musgrave Harbour. The proposal for the garden met resistance from the town council and town manager Mrs. Cassandra Mollins specifically. However, Mr. Abbott clarified that the project did not need to be scaled back, as it did not depend on the council for space or funding. Rather, the United Way was willing to provide funding of 100% of $50,000 required for the design. It seemed like a perfect way to engage the community without straining local resources. Mr. Abbott's enthusiasm, however, met with misunderstanding and a negative response. He was supposedly sending frequent and detailed emails to Mrs. Mollin, reportedly as many as 20 a week, covering everything from small procedural concerns to larger council issues. Mrs. Mollin, the town manager, found this overwhelming and claimed that Mr. Abbott's persistence extended beyond office hours, allegedly sending messages on Facebook at night. Mr. Abbott contends his actions were reasonable, always prefacing his messages with a gesture to respond at her convenience, and he asserted that it was not as excessive as reported. This interaction between Mr. Abbott and Mrs. Moland was the straw that broke the camel's back after years of public pressure and scrutiny. Mrs. Mollin later described how these communications contributed to a deteriorating relationship. She stated that when her grandfather passed away, Mr. Abbott allegedly referred to her bereavement leave as convenient, a claim Mr. Abbott contends was never made. Other conflicts arose involving local entrepreneur Mrs. Kim Butt, who owns the senior citizens complex in the community. After presenting plans to expand her family's business at a public meeting, Mrs. Butt felt her ideas were publicly shared by Mr. Abbott just days later against her privacy rights, including details about prospective lands he wanted to discuss after exploring properties for his community garden project. Mrs. Butt believed Mr. Abbott's actions were malicious or negligent, although he thought they stemmed from a misunderstanding. In an effort to clarify, Mr. Abbott attempted to contact Mrs. Butt, but faced resistance when the council refused to allow him to discuss items from a recent Parks and Recreation meeting of which he was chairman. As a result, he shared the notes from that meeting, which included mentions of Mrs. Butt's project and the prospective lands, to express the value of the discussion. This escalation led to further tensions, as Mrs. Butt threatened that failure to address Mr. Abbott's actions might result in the senior complex no longer providing 911 service to the community. Mr. Chalk, Deputy Fire Chief and Deputy Mayor at the time, believed this could be a negative change, as the town depended on Bell for pager service and did not want to split services or reduce their reliance on Bell products. Mr. Abbott had been promoting a switch to Explore Net, viewing it as a better option for the town, opening options such as broadcasting public meetings and the harbour itself. As tensions mounted, the conflict took a more personal turn. Mr. Abbott's relationship with Mrs. Mollin reached a breaking point when, in June 2021, Mrs. Mollin's husband, Mr. Brad Mollin, a town employee at the time, drove to Mr. Abbott's property and confronted him, accusing him of harassing his wife. It must be noted that this was all before Mr. Abbott was elected as councillor a few months later. Mr. Abbott testified that Mr. Mollin acted aggressively and alleged that another confrontation occurred later, involving Mr. Mollin riding a dirt bike near Mr. Abbott's ATV and children in an intimidating manner, later resulting in a peace bond against Mr. Mollin for the events. The ongoing harassment greatly affected the quality of Mr. Abbott's family life, particularly leading to the departure of his mother-in-law back to Ontario, where she left all her belongings behind due to these tensions. Additionally, the situation escalated with the disappearance of two lighthouse lawn features and even a bullet shot through their kitchen window in the wee hours of the morning as the family slept a year later. By late 2021, the mounting pressure was too much for Mrs. Moreland, who resigned from her position as town manager, citing her difficult working relationship with Mr. Abbott as a primary reason. Two other councillors, including Mr. Brandon Pardey and Mrs. Jenny Molin, also resigned, pointing to similar concerns, as well as vaccination policies. In response to the growing unrest, the town of Musgrave Harbour initiated a formal workplace investigation into Mr. Abbott's conduct. Led by Mr. John Whalen, a human resource lawyer from Whalen Dispute Resolution, the inquiry sought to determine whether Mr. Abbott's actions constituted harassment under the occupational health and safety regulations. The investigation involved interviews of council members and employees of the town, reviews of audio recordings from council meetings, and an extensive examination of written communications. Despite the claims made by Mrs. Molin and others, Mr. Whelan concluded that while Mr. Abbott's behaviour may have been frustrating and overwhelming, it did not meet the legal threshold for harassment. He noted that there was no evidence Mr. Abbott intended to humiliate or intimidate anyone. As Mr. Whelan stated in his report, his conduct may have been unacceptable from their perspective, but it was not harassment as defined in the regulations. Mr. Abbott insisted that his actions were in the town's best interest and driven by his commitment to transparency and accountability. The investigation also revealed that the problems within the council were not solely the result of Mr. Abbott's behaviour. The breakdown in communication and governance was a shared responsibility. While Mrs. Butt initially felt that Mr. Abbott's handling of her family's business information was malicious, Mr. Abbott believed this stemmed from a collusion involving Mrs. Moreland, her relatives and Mrs. Butt, leading to her complaint. This tension was further compounded by other complaints from the general public, including from Mrs. Moreland's mother, Mr. Molin, and the town clerk, Miss Amber Littlejohn, current town clerk and sister-in-law to Mrs. Molin, and later a few more complaints resulting in the vacation of Mr. Abbott's seat. These added layers of grievances and personal relationships complicated the matter in what Mr. Abbott felt was a malicious way. Council matters in Musgrave Harbour often tend to be family affairs, with decisions and conflict shaped by personal ties rather than functioning as a fully democratic and open system. This dynamic contributed to the heightened tensions and feelings of exclusion. In the end, the investigation into Mr. Abbott's conduct did not result in a finding of harassment, but it did expose significant issues within Musgrave Harbour's council and show many ways towards improvement through responsibility and accountability. Mr. Abbott's passion for transparency and his determination to improve the community were clear. Mr. Abbott's approach, along with communication breakdowns and how Mrs. Molin responded to the situation, as well as the lack of clear boundaries, policies and procedures without oversight, created an environment of frustration and dysfunction. Mr. Abbott's responsibility for this HR investigation and its results should not fall solely on his shoulders. Rather, it should be seen as a collective issue among all of the councillors and administration of the town. The resignations of key council members, including Mrs. Moreland and Mayor Steele, were a direct result of the ongoing tensions. This narrative encompasses more than just one individual's wrongdoing and invites deeper analysis for those genuinely interested. It's a reflection of how personal conflicts and misunderstandings can escalate when not properly addressed with no oversight, particularly in a small community like Musgrave Harbour. Ultimately, the town's experience serves as a cautionary tale. Even the best intentions can lead to conflict if there is a lack of open dialogue, respect for boundaries, and a willingness to accommodate different perspectives. Over $73,000 of your taxes have been spent fighting Mr. Abbott. It's about time you hold your corporation accountable for their actions and your community's future. Keep up the good fight.